speaking of why there is this, total political failure in America, particularly on guns, you can't help but talk about the Republican Party. And what is so funny is that clearly Mitch McConnell and John Boehner, the kind of lobbyist bagman, far right, who kind of wanted to take over Congress, sit there on their majorities and quietly decimate the social safety net and hand favors out to their buddies. I think that they were planning on maybe we could have several months before the presidential race heats up and we can, give a lot of, run the corporate Tammany Hall or whatever it is their vision of governing is for the next couple of months. So
that's about right, actually.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So if you guys could, people want to run for president, just cool it for a couple of months. Don't come out and talk about, the Civil Rights Act or rape or whatever. And then all of a sudden on the first, Steve Scalise spoke to white supremacists. And now the presidential race is starting. Mitt Romney, we had an incredible amount of fun reliving his great humiliations, and I think I finally found a way to impersonate Mitt, but it made me lightheaded, actually. But that's a story for another day. Jeb Bush is obviously, it's now or never for him. And then even the dregs of the dregs, Rick Santorum, is actually talking about running for president. So.
And he's ripping the other social conservatives, which is what is so awesome about it. Like, he's ripping Paul and Cruz, and they're ripping him and Huckabee, and now on the establishment side, I feel like, my guess is that, and again, let's be clear, because I think I said something out on Twitter the other day. I can't stand it when these guys get away with saying, well, the more moderate establishment, they're not moderate if you look at Mr. Severe Conservative Romney, and if you look at Jeb Bush's record as governor, they're not more moderate. There's really only two things that you have to be an establishment Republican, which is you need to, or one or the other, you need to either be wealthy or be from a coastal state, or both.
Right.
That makes you an establishment Republican, because they're not, all right? They're not, in other words, they're not any more, they may be slightly more moderate on something, and I shouldn't even say slightly more moderate, all right? They may be slightly more on, like, immigration, one thing that makes, because it's the business people are coming for them.
Right.
But that's it. And so, yeah, it's been a lot of fun because basically what Mitt Romney's Jeb thought he could sort of announce, he was looking into it, take his time. The other conservatives have been sort of running for a while. We know who they are. But I think first Huckabee getting in, because Huckabee did relatively well in 2008 and does have a base of support with basically being involved with every right-wing network, book, whatever, over the last 8 years since he ran. But then even more so Romney, because Romney obviously is going to have the leftover name recognition that's going to put him in first place in a lot of these polls. He does have wealthy friends who he can fundraise with. And so, that creates a situation where it puts pressure on the other wing of the party. So Huckabee's kind of pressured the Rand Pauls of the world to jump in like full force, which Rand has now done, and that's led him to go around and say stupid things, insulting veterans about Social Security and others, because they're one of the first acts of this Republican Congress, who said they care about elderly people who voted for them, was to try and say that that Social Security needs to be reformed, or they're not going to give out disability payments under Social Security, which, by the way, includes a lot of veterans who they claim to always like.
And reform means cut, as we know. And Rand Paul not only insulted that, to get specific, he basically said a lot of people who have supposed disabilities, they have a sore back, or they have like a bad, it's an emotional issue. That was literally what he said. And I think it's just fascinating because, there's nothing better, particularly with and we'll get to it because it actually looks like the Democrats might finally be pricking up and figuring things out a little bit. But nothing historically is better for damaging the Republican Party than giving the country undivided attention to the Republican Party.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. I just want the more of these guys to talk, to have their clown car debates. There may be 30 of them this time, for all we know, all going at each other like lions in a Roman arena, just tearing each other apart. There really isn't much more than a dime's worth of difference between any of them. I mean, they're all right-wing kooks, and there's just different levels of right-wing kookdom. But they're not, as I said, not vastly different levels. None of them, between all of them, have an economic plan that can work and do anything for this country. None of them, between all of them, have a health care plan that could do anything to help this country. None of them, between all of them, have an education plan to help this country. There's really just different levels of how much they hate different groups of people. That's the only thing that differentiates them.
Let me say this too. I mean, and then I want to actually ask you a more kind of substantive point about this. But I just want to say, like, does anybody doubt? Rand Paul rightly gets a lot of flack for opposing the Civil Rights Act, and absolutely correctly. And he whines about it. And now he denies that he ever said it. But it's like literally on tape. He opposed the Civil Rights Act. Does anybody doubt that any of these candidates, the Mitt Romney, Jeb Bush, maybe even Ben Carson, does anybody doubt that if they were in politics, the political equivalents of themselves in the 1960s, that any of them would have voted for the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act? None of them would. None of them.
Not.
It's not just Rand Paul.
Nor Medicare, nor Medicaid, nor Social Security, none of them.
Well, that's the stuff they're upfront about. I'm saying even with civil rights, which they would all kind of say, oh, well, of course I would support that.
Right, they have to pretend that they're
wouldn't.
Yeah. No. I really think, my guess would be virtually none of them. If Jeb Bush or Mitt Romney had stayed true to the lineage of their families in the Republican Party, I'm talking going back to Prescott Bush, I'm talking George Romney, who were actual moderates, and George Romney, who was a supporter of civil rights, maybe, but only if they could get away with it. They've betrayed that legacy. So the men they are today, if they were just to suddenly go back in time, no, they couldn't, because and so I mean. Yeah, you've got all that. The one thing I wanted to say before we change any topic or even move on at all is when you brought up that comment by Rand Paul about the sore back and, saying such obnoxious things and ridiculing people. And people need to always remember one thing with this guy, with what a dishonest huckster he is. Because when he was an ophthalmologist, he took patients on Medicare. Okay?
Right.
The guy who's principally against Medicare and doesn't think it, because the government's too big. And when asked why he did it, he said, well, doctors have the right to make a decent living too.
I have a right to make a good living and respect the Constitution.
So he has the right to make a good living. If you're disabled, disabled, you don't have the right to make a good living.
Right.
You don't have the right to do okay. Apparently, you should be mocked. Right? If you're African American, you don't have the right to have him support you in the Civil Rights Act. Of course, now he's claiming he would have, but we know for years he claimed quite publicly he wouldn't have, because that was just going too far and taking the personal rights away, and the government's doing too much. When the government's doing too much, however, in his view, to give people Medicare, which he gets wealthy off of, that's totally different. He has the right to a good living, so that's totally different, right? Yeah. Exactly.
No, the last point I want before we move to the Democrats is it earlier this week Sam had on Thomas Schaller talking about his new book, Stronghold, and really basically
great guy, by the way, great book.
Really, really interesting argument, and I think it is fascinating. I've always been of the school that Paul Ryan is like, what Diet Coke is to health, Paul Ryan is to intellectualism. Like, I never buy this whole notion that he's some great policy wonk. But I did think it was really interesting that he chose that he's not going to run in 2016. Frankly, I think if he ran, he could be a guy who could get a lot of support because he could, he is a rabid extremist right-winger for real and has credibility with that community, but he ticks enough boxes and has enough of a kind of fake narrative around him to, for at least them to think he would be appealing in a general election. He clearly has his eyes on being speaker and being a power broker in the House, and it does look like, is this just where we're at? That Republicans have gerrymandered the House. There's maybe an acceptance outside of the kind of emotional delusions of a guy like Mitt Romney that them winning the White House is going to be really difficult. I mean, of course, possible, but very difficult. But hey, we can just sit in Congress, cash lobbyist checks, and hold up progress or inflict damage. And that's the strategy. And to me, I buy the demographic arguments. It really doesn't favor Republicans. It really is. We are moving as a country, certainly socially, and I think even economically amongst public attitudes, not amongst elites, but amongst broad public attitudes into a more progressive direction. But they can just sit there from tiny districts and hold things up.
Well, that's very true. And that is a problem. There's a bigger problem, actually, also when it comes to Paul Ryan, and you can lay the blame right at the doorstep of absolute disgraced failure of a DCCC chairman, Steve Israel, which is he gave no support to a couple of very competent, very, very, really good candidates who took on Paul Ryan. That is not one of these gerrymandered right-wing districts. Paul Ryan's district is a swing district, which I believe in 2008 Obama won, and in 2012 I believe he was winning it even I think he won. If Ryan I think on the presidential side, he won the district, even though Ryan won the congressional district, or he barely lost it on the presidential side. So the point is that is a swing district.
That's
it is
incredible.
a district that if we were putting resources into and actually trying to win and making this guy what he should be, the poster boy for all that is wrong, we should be able to knock him out. So he's a separate issue. But overall, you're right. Overall, it's a very dangerous situation in terms of, the country just not doing anything. I mean, not being able to respond to our problems, because I agree with you. Demographically, in the long run, as Arizona and Georgia move away from these guys with North Carolina and some of these other states, eventually Texas joins that. It may take a little longer than some people optimistically hope, but there is going to be a point where there are going to be enough states that these guys can't control. That sure, I mean, maybe Kansas isn't changing demographically, and maybe Wyoming isn't, and maybe Mississippi isn't. I'm not saying there won't be a sort of dozen or so states where they can still, continue to be the lunatics they are. But an interesting poll that I saw, and this is going back 6 months, a year ago now, showed that that the youngest voting generation now, not just even white rural members of that generation have jumped to the left of the older generations on issues like gay marriage and on economic issues and things of that sort. So I think you're going to see even some of those places change, at least to a certain degree, even if they don't become progressive.
Well, because I think another big reason that I always say too is that for our generations, for younger people who are actually living under. I mean, I know that this stuff started, obviously you've lived through it too, but if you really were like, a millennial, like, any, younger people, all of this stuff that was like an abstraction for so many years, like it hit the poorest, it hit the most vulnerable people that don't get, they don't get talked about nearly enough, obviously, and we know that. But by the time we came of age, accumulating with the economic crisis, all of this stuff was like, it wasn't some fairy tale that Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan and, Bush were talking about. It was like, oh my God, this is what it means when you gut education. This is what it means when student loans are quadrupled. This is what it means when you deregulate the financial markets. It means less jobs, terrible inequality, and it even means that, frankly, even if you're in a relatively privileged position, you're paying off way more debt than you would be otherwise. And and also if and working harder and longer, even in those good positions. And frankly, unless you're a sociopath, you don't feel great about your cohort being totally screwed over.
That's right. I mean, that's part of it, and you can also, there are issues, I think, with people, with the younger people, where they can look at issues that they don't even understand why gay rights is an issue.
Absolutely.
Why it's even being argued about.
Absolutely.
And the other day, something like this came up. I remember my older son is 8, and something about, my wife and I were talking about something, and she was like, why would somebody, and it came up, and my son basically knows what being gay is, he knows people who are two men who are together and whatever, doesn't know details, he's too young, but knows the basics, and when it's come up, something came up, and he was like, why would somebody discriminate against somebody because they love another man?
Right.
He doesn't even get it. He doesn't get it. And
no, it's unfathomable. And I think actually the other big part of that, Cliff, that's also true is that starts to eliminate the whole like, well, I'm a social, liberal, fiscal, conservative thing, because at this point it's become like, well, if you have such a crazy view of gay people, wouldn't your views of the economy be just as demented and bizarre as that? Like, why would there be any difference?
No, that's true, and I'm just saying. I think for young people, that's an issue. I think immigration, because of who their friends are. I think that when it comes to the stuff hitting you personally, also, and that stuff hits you personally because it's your friends. Right. But also, when you come out and you're seeing the fact that most people are working many more hours, wages, as much as the economy is coming back now, wages are still flat. and they still suck. And you're seeing you're seeing that the cost of living has gone up in a lot of cities that people, millennials and other people just coming out of school will try to live in. As many people do. Often they maybe end up going back to where they came from eventually, or whatever. But you try living in New York or San Francisco or Chicago, or a place like that, and suddenly you can't even afford it.
That's how you start a career.
Yeah. I mean, you're living with 8 people in a 2-bedroom or something, and you just can't do anything. And so it's I think that how can that not affect people's thinking? People who grew up during the Bush years and saw this.